wind groaned like a beast just beyond the threshold, pressing its weight into the old stones of the abbey as if trying to return to something it once knew. Dusk bled slowly through the narrow windows, soft and grey, painting shadows across the cloister like the fingers of the dead. The candle in the scriptorium had burned low, its wax curling like skin peeled back from bone, trembling each time the walls moaned with cold. Brother Marek sat alone, his ink-stained hands hovering above parchment he no longer dared to finish. The Latin script blurred, not from age, but fear. A fear that had crept beneath his robes, into his chest, and settled near his spine like frost. He had seen it, not a vision, not a dream, a gap in the wall, torn open by the storm. A seal broken, buried behind centuries of silence. A symbol none of the monks had spoken of, but one they had always feared. He did not sleep that night, and when he rose for matins, he found the chapel colder than the wind outside. The crucifix swayed gently on its iron hook, creaking above the empty pews. No one else had noticed, or perhaps they pretended not to. The older monks looked past Marek now, as though something in him had shifted, as if dust had begun to settle in his gaze. The monastery was built on silence, not the peaceful kind, born of prayer, but the heavy kind, the kind used to bury sins, to vial for parchment. They called it a sanctuary, but Marek was beginning to see it for what it truly was, a cage built to hold memory, and memory was waking. That night the wind returned, this time laced with whispers. It crept beneath door frames, slid down chimney flues, curled into the corners of the cloister where statues of saints stared blindly at the floor. Marek felt it in his teeth, in the marrow of his hands. He could hear chanting, not with his ears, but through the stone, through the bones of the monastery itself. A language not spoken for generations, not meant to be remembered. He returned to the wall, alone, lantern in hand. The brick that had fallen now lay shattered in a puddle of wax and ash. Behind the breach, the glinting seal had dulled, but its presence grew heavier, like a second breath behind his own. He stepped forward. The wall was colder now, but within that cold, a pulse. He pressed his palm to the stone. Beneath it, the warmth returned, faint, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something long buried. He recoiled, but something stirred in him. Not courage, not defiance, something older, the need to know, the ache for truth. They had told him nothing. His superiors had kept him in prayer and penance, feeding him scripture, denying him questions. But now the stones were speaking, and the psalms had grown hollow. He had begun to remember things he never lived, faces not his own, screams behind doors he had never opened. That night, he did not attend He waited until the final bell, or what should have been the final bell, for it no longer rang. Its tongue had been cut centuries before, a warning cast in bronze. He took his lantern, his cloak, and descended into the chapel alone. The rug in the scriptorium had been moved. No one said anything, but someone had tried to nail it back down. Marek lifted it without hesitation. The trapdoor groaned beneath his hand like a sleeping mouth. The rusted iron handle burned cold into his fingers, and when it opened, it sighed. The air below was damp, old, alive. The steps descended in a spiral, cut from stone to smooth to be quarried by men of this region. They shone like wet bone in the lamplight. He descended slowly. Dust rose like breath from each step. The silence thickened until even the flame of his lantern began to dim, as though light itself feared what lay below. At the bottom, The stair opened into a narrow corridor, walls arched and carved with symbols. Some were crosses. Others were older, crude shapes etched with haste and panic. Marek touched one and felt a vibration, faint but insistent, like the string of a lute plucked in sorrow. Then he saw them, candles. Long dead, their wax melted into the shape of hands. 6 of them, arranged in a circle. And in the center, a chain, thick, blackened, broken. He staggered back. His mind reeled with images that weren't his. A nobleman in silk robes screaming into stone. Choir boys chanting in falsetto until their voices cracked. An abbot whispering something in the ear of a faceless statue before he carved his own name from his forehead. This was no crypt. It was not built to bury. It was built to hold. The broken chain glinted in his lantern light, and beside it, a book lay open, its pages blank but stained with tears. Marek knelt, not in reverence, not in prayer, but in sorrow, for something had been sacrificed here, not once, but many times. And the monastery above had been built not on rock, but on silence, a silence thick with guilt. He closed his eyes and whispered the psalm he had forgotten. This time, he remembered every word. The air stirred, something, listened, and somewhere above, the crucifix ceased its creaking. The monastery held its breath, and Marek opened the book. The flame falters. For a moment, there is no light at all, only the sound of breath, his own shallow and fast, echoing against stone that remembers more than it reveals. Brother Odo stands at the base of the stairwell, lantern raised, its dim glow barely clinging to the walls. The cold is thick here, not the natural chill of forgotten places, but the kind that coils from something buried too long. His boots press into ancient dust, and beneath the dust, runes scratched deep into the floor as if by broken nails. Above him, the chapel bell does not ring. Below, the air is wet, metallic, breathing. The walls whisper not in words, but in long, drawn sighs of forgotten breath. This place was not built by monks. It was hidden by them. The mortar smells of old iron and frankincense, a mingling of holiness and rust. Odo knows this scent. It is the same from the skin-bound book he found tucked behind a hollow shelf, disguised as a missile. It spoke of the ones before and the ritual of silent mouths, of monks who stitched their lips and buried their hearts in jars. It was not scripture, it was memory. His lantern catches on a low arch. The passage narrows, and the stone becomes damp, weeping through fissures like open wounds. There are no icons down here, no saints to pray to, no crosses to kiss, only a crude carving of a man chained at the wrists and neck, his mouth wide in a scream. Or song, Odo whispers. A prayer but cannot remember the words. He reaches a chamber. It yawns before him like a forgotten lung, low-ceilinged and heavy with silence. 7 pillars hold the ceiling, but each is etched with unfamiliar symbols, triangular loops, eyes without lids, coiled beasts biting their own tails. In the center, a circle of melted wax and dried blood. The prior's robe lies crumpled near the far wall, torn down the middle, no sign of the man. Only a candle burned to the root, and a small iron key, still warm to the touch. Something in the shadows moves, not with violence, but with sorrow. He turns quickly, but there is nothing, just the sound of dripping and a long groan of stone as if the walls shift under their own weight. His lantern flickers again, casting long, jerking silhouettes across the walls. The air begins to hum, soft at first, like the low drone of monks in deep chant but off dissonant. It grates against the bones, and then he sees it. Etched into the far wall, half hidden behind a curtain of roots and mold, is a door. Not built by monks, older, its arch too narrow, too tall. No hinges, only black iron rivets that look hammered by unsteady hands. And in the center, a symbol scorched into the wood, the same sigil from the forbidden manuscript, the silent mouth. Odo steps forward, unable to stop himself. The air thickens. His heart kicks against his ribs like a dying bird. The manuscript had said, "Speak not, lest it know your name." But Odo had already spoken. In prayer, in doubt, in fear, his hand finds the iron ring. Cold, biting, he pulls. The door groans open. Darkness, deeper than night, spills out like a breath long held. And with it, the smell, salt, old rot, and something like burned feathers. His lantern dims to a red pulse, then dies. But the whispering continues. He steps inside. What greets him is not a chamber, but a descent. The stairs are narrow, as if made for smaller feet. The walls curve inward, oppressive. The whispers become clearer now. A litany in no tongue he knows, but one his bones seem to remember. He descends further. There are marks along the walls, fingers dragged through moss, clawing, pleading. Odo passes an alcove, a shelf of jars, each sealed with wax and marked with runes. Inside, something floats in brine. A heart, another, a third. They throb. Still he reaches the final level. Here, the stone is blackened. Ash coats the floor. A great stone altar dominates the room, cracked down the middle. Chains hang from the ceiling, some snapped, others still clasped, empty. In the shadows, a figure kneels before the altar, hooded, silent. Odo does not speak. The figure lifts its head. Beneath the hood, no face, only skin pulled tight over bone. Where eyes should be, only stitched slits. It does not move, but it watches. Odo feels it press against his thoughts, not with words, but with memory. Flashes of fire, of children singing, then screaming. A voice in his mind, soft as breath. You read, you remembered, you opened. Behind him, the door creaks. Shut. The air grows warmer. He steps back, heart pounding, but the whisper comes again. It must not sleep again. It must be fed. Odo sees the prior now, not vanished, but bound in the shadows, mouth sewn, hands raw. Others too, monks once thought to have left the order, now kneeling in prayer that will never end. Their skin is pale as parchment, their eyes gone. He understands. This is not possession, it is inheritance. The monastery above was not a place of peace. It was a lid, a seal. This was the root, and he had broken it. From above, a distant bell rings, the first in decades. It tolls once. Then again, the sound does not comfort. It warns. Odo kneels. He does not pray, he waits. And in the silence, something ancient stirs. The stone beneath his knees pulses, and far above, in the windswept chapel, the crucifix splits along the grain. Next, the choir returns, but it does not sing. The snow entered like a confession, soft, unasked for, burdened with memory. It crept through the shattered apse window in slow spirals, kissing the worn flagstones where monks once knelt in the chill of matins. Light did not follow, only the pale hush of ash-colored flakes drifting into a place that no longer answered to heaven. What stood now was not a monastery, but a wound too stubborn to close. The roof had given way some time after the plague. No one had recorded the year. The library burned. The priory bell cracked. The brotherhood faded, not all at once, but like candle flames dying in a long hallway. Yet the walls endured, vines clawing at their joints, crows nesting in the clear story. And beneath it all, the stones held memory like bonehold's marrow. They remembered what the villagers refused to speak. They called it the place of the moaning earth, not in jest, but in caution. Children were told to whistle when passing by, for silence invited notice. Shepherds avoided its shadow, even in drought, and when the wind turned a certain way, always from the north, a deep, aching sound echoed up through the ruin, as if the earth itself remembered voices once bound to chant in early spring of 1382. Alaric came. He arrived not as a pilgrim, but as a debtor, a man with nothing left to lose but his guilt. His hands trembled, not from age, but from memory. Once a mason of reputation, he had built a chapel where his wife was buried, only to sell the land years later, too drunk to remember who bought it. Now, widowed, broken, and shamed, he arrived with 2 apprentices and a mule that limped when the road turned muddy. He did not believe in curses, not then. The bishop who hired him wanted ruins reborn, a place of relics and miracles to attract coin and footsteps. There was no holiness in the order, only profit. Alaric understood this. He did not mind. He had stopped asking for absolution long ago. The first apprentice disappeared on the second night. No scream, no blood, just a blanket still warm and footprints that ended near the choir stall. They searched until dawn. The second apprentice, a boy with a hare lip and frightened eyes, refused to sleep inside the abbey after that. He built a crude shelter among the nettles outside the cloister wall. On the third day, the mule refused to cross the nave. It reared when Alaric tugged the rope, snorting and sweating despite the cold. Its eyes rolled white. It would not move. Forward, that evening, it snapped its tether and fled into the woods, never seen again. But Alaric remained. He had debts, and the bishop's purse was heavy. He patched the nave with timber. He reinforced the sacristy. And on the 5th day, while clearing away collapsed choir stalls, he found it, a stair of smooth black stone beneath rotted oak and lichen. It descended, not sharply, but in a patient spiral, as though bored into the earth by something not in haste. Moss covered the walls. Water clung to the ceiling in long, shivering droplets. Strange bones curved like antlers, but hollow as reed, were wedged between the cracks. One bore a mark carved in spirals, too exact to be accident. He descended with a torch. Each step echoed not down, but upward, as if the vault itself breathed. At the bottom, he found a chamber. Not built, he was sure of that, but shaped as if the rock had melted and cooled into purpose. The walls bore no crosses, no saints, only crude symbols, mouths without faces, towers without doors, ropes twisted around headless forms. And at the center stood a stone altar, older than Roman cut, older perhaps than the abbey itself. Upon it sat a chalice, clay glazed in green, humming with a stillness that pressed against his ears. Inside, something glistened. He did not think, he did not pray, he drank. Grief does not reason, it only wants. And in that instant, Alaric wanted his wife more than he feared death. The taste was not bitter, nor sweet. It was absence, like waking from a dream you forgot too quickly. And in its wake, she came. Not as she was in life, but as something standing in the light behind his closed eyes. Her face, remembered but wrong. Her voice, wrong but familiar. She spoke not in words, but in knowing. She showed him the chains beneath the stones, not chains of iron, but memory, bound tight, rusted shut. She told him what the monks had hidden, why the earth moaned, why the bells fell silent. Something had been buried here, something not to be named, not even in Latin, a hunger not of flesh, but of silence, a promise bound by ritual and rot. And the monastery, the holy place, had not been built to house the sacred, but to hold it down. That night the bells rang, not just one, all of them, the great bell of the apse, whose tongue had been cut, the sacristy chime, whose rope had long since crumbled to dust. They rang in harmony, in terror, in declaration. No one touched them. The villagers heard. They barred their doors and carved crosses in ash upon their thresholds. A shepherd wept. A crone spat into her fire and whispered, "It wakes." Alaric stood beneath the belfry, alone, his apprentices gone, the mule a ghost, his wife's voice still curling in his ear like candle smoke. He looked at his hands. They no longer shook, and then he heard it beneath the snow, beneath the stone, a sound like breath exhaled through centuries of dust. Not words, not song, but hunger and above. The forest leaned in closer. The next morning, the sun did not rise. Only a red-grey sky, heavy with something that did not fall. Alaric walked once more to the stair, the torch in his hand unlit, but his path certain. Some call it madness, others call it penance, but he called it return. And beneath the earth, something waited not for saints nor kings, but for one who drank and remembered. And the chalice remained, still full, still warm, still thirsting. The iron door gave way without protest. It opened as though it had been waiting. Not for Brother Jahan in particular, but for someone with trembling hands and fractured faith. The hinges sighed like lungs awakening after a long sleep, and the scent that wafted forth was not of rot nor damp stone, but of warm blood and candle smoke, as if time itself had been burning slowly in the dark, waiting to be seen. Jahan stepped beyond the threshold with the solemnity of one entering a grave that bore his own name. The corridor swallowed the light behind him. Walls pressed inward like ribs of a great beast, and the air thickened with a silence that wasn't natural. It listened, it judged. Each step he took echoed softly, but not alone, as though his footfalls stirred shadows that walked with him. Step for step, breath for breath. He clutched his torch tighter, not for light, but for courage. On the walls, the glyphs returned. He had seen them once, 20 years ago, when he was still young enough to believe that obedience protected the soul. But now they glowed faintly, traced not in paint or ink, but in veins of something that pulsed like sap or blood. And he realized they were not carved onto the wall, but grown within it, like the bark of a twisted tree. He paused. There was a sound, faint, rhythmic, not quite breathing, not quite a chant. It came from the deep, from whatever lay behind the second door, because there was a second, hidden from plain sight, masked by a collapse of stone. Jahan now understood was intentional. The wall bore stress fractures. Tools had once been used, not to build, but to bury, and someone had not done it well enough. He dropped to his knees, cleared the rubble with the caution of a priest handling relics. Every stone he moved felt warmer than it should, as if it remembered fire. When at last the second door emerged, It bore no handle, no hinges, no seam, just a single carved word written in a tongue older than Rome. It meant return. Jahan laid his hand upon it. The surface trembled, not from within, but from him. His heartbeat matched the rhythm pulsing. Behind the door, a question filled his chest, not spoken, not understood, but heavy, as if the monastery itself demanded an answer to a sin long forgotten by men. And the door opened. There was no lock, no mechanism. It simply parted like breath on cold air, revealing a chamber that defied age. It was not a crypt, not a tomb. It was a memory carved in architecture. 8 columns circled the room like sentinels, each bearing a different symbol: a wolf, a blade, a tree stripped of leaves, a weeping face, and others that shifted when one blinked. At the center stood a basin. It was shallow, silver, empty, except for a single red thread coiled like a sleeping worm. Jahan stepped forward, drawn by a sadness he could not name. The basin pulsed once, and a whisper filled the chamber. Not in Latin, not in French, but in the first language he had ever known, the voice of his mother, now long dead. "You broke it." He stumbled back. His torch fell, guttered, yet the room remained lit, dimly, as if the stone itself remembered the sun. The voice came again, softer. "You severed the chain." Jahan wept. He did not understand, but in his bones he knew. This place was not built by monks. It had been claimed by them. It had not always been Christian. It had been older, wilder, sacred to something forgotten when Rome marched north. He looked around. The columns pulsed faintly, now echoing heartbeats, and on the far side of the chamber steps, descending further, he should have left. The bells above had not rung. The air behind him was colder now. He was alone in the deepest part of the monastery, beyond maps, beyond prayer. But something inside him, not courage, not madness, something ancestral urged him forward. Down. The next chamber was narrower, walls smooth as glass. A single candle burned in the far corner, though there was no wax, no wick, no heat. It simply existed. Beside it sat a figure, cloaked in robes darker than the room, motionless. And then it breathed. Jahan fell to one knee, not out of fear, but reverence. The figure raised its head, and though no face could be seen, a memory struck him like thunder, the dream he had suffered 3 nights ago, a battlefield, but no war. Just a woman holding a bowl, bleeding from her eyes, whispering the word open. The figure did not speak. It extended a hand, not toward Jahan, but toward the basin he had left behind. It pointed, then faded, like mist pulled into stone. Rose, trembling. He understood now. Something had been sealed here, not to contain evil, but to contain memory, to protect men from truths they could not bear. He returned to the upper chamber. The red thread was gone. In its place, a single drop of water, but it shimmered like silver. He touched it, and in an instant he remembered, not his own life, but lives layered beneath, his monks, knights, druids, shepherds. All had come here. All had knelt. All had tried to forget. He staggered back into the corridor, breath ragged, the key still in his hand. The walls no longer pulsed. The glyphs were silent. The monastery above was changing. He felt it when he emerged into the cloister. The sky was grey. Rain had begun to fall. The abbot had died. No bell was rung. Brother Jahan returned to the oculus chamber, laid down the key, and opened his scripture. He wrote not words, but symbols, not doctrine, but warning. He did not sleep that night, because in the silence, beneath the floor, something breathed, something not evil, not divine, just forgotten. And in the morning, a boy in the village would wake screaming, claiming a woman with weeping eyes had whispered in his dreams the same word Jahan had once buried deep in his heart: return. The rain did not stop. It fell in soft sheets over the cloister garden, hissing against the dying herbs, whispering into the cracks of centuries-old stone. It gathered in pools at the feet of statues, whose eyes had long been washed blank, and it slid like tears down the iron grate that once sealed the chamber beneath the well. The same grate now bent, its wax seal fractured, its scripture unreadable. The earth had opened, not with violence, but with surrender, as if tired of bearing its secret. Ewan stood barefoot on the soaked flagstones, the hem of his robe black with mud. He could not speak, but if he could, perhaps he would have said nothing anyway, for some truths were louder in silence. His eyes, wide as wounds, stared not at the broken seal, but at the black moor below. The air that rose from it was warm, wet, laced with the scent of oil and something metallic. Not rot, not death, something older. In the hours before, during, matins the wind had spoken in ways no psalm ever had. It had twisted through the rafters and slammed open the chapel doors with a sound like a breath too long held. And the wax had cracked not in heat, but in cold. That was when the birds screamed, not songbirds, but crows, dozens of them, rising like a black wave from the bell tower where they had been nesting since midsummer. The other monks thought it an omen. They were right. Ewan's descent was not heroic. It was trembling, driven less by courage than by compulsion, like a sleeper obeying the logic of a dream. He lifted the grate with both arms, skin peeling on the rusted iron, nails catching on sharp edges, but he did not cry out. He had never learned how. The ladder beneath led not into a cellar, but into another world. The stones here were smooth, not carved, as if shaped by hands that did not build, but birthed. The walls pulsed faintly with warmth, and here and there, inscriptions glowed faintly with some mossy bioluminescence, curling like veins. It was not a crypt, it was not a dungeon. It was older than language. He passed chains, still fixed into the walls, their loops clean, free of dust, as if they had been used not long ago. In one corner, there was a kind of cradle, shaped not of wood, but of femurs and ribs, polished to a shine. It was empty now, but the stone beneath it was still wet with something that glistened red and thin. And then, the books. They were stacked haphazardly, wrapped in cloth too soft to be linen. When Ewan brushed it aside, the bindings throbbed. Slightly in his hands, stitched not by thread, but by sinew. He opened one, and it bled at the spine. Not blood, but something like it. Black, thin, fragrant. The pages whispered as they turned, not in voice, but in memory. And the words, if they were words, twisted like smoke, refusing to hold shape unless stared at sideways. One name echoed in his skull again and again. Eloque, not spoken, not taught, remembered, as Ewan climbed back into the garden. The rain had ceased, but the world was not dry. The air was thick with stillness, like the monastery itself had stopped breathing. No bell told the hour, no crow called, and no light came from the east. The sky above the cloister was not dark, but grey, blank, as if dawn had forgotten how to rise. In the refectory, monks whispered of foul winds, of firewood that would not catch flame, of honey that turned bitter. Brother Jahan, pale from sleeplessness, said nothing, only stared at the crucifix above the hearth, like a man realizing it had never looked back. That night, the bishop sent word by rider that he would not return. Ewan walked among the monks like a shadow, silent as ever, but they avoided his gaze. Even the blind ones seemed to sense him, and though no one spoke it aloud, all felt it. Something had been opened, and it had marked him. He did not eat, he did not sleep, but he read. In the far corner of the scriptorium, behind a tapestry of the martyrdom of Saint Erasmus, he found a hollow in the wall just wide enough to hide what he had taken. The bleeding books rested there now, hidden from trembling hands, but not from time. He opened one each night. The voices came more clearly now, not as madness, but as memory, not possession, recognition. He began to trace the old glyphs in ash, on stone, on doors, on skin. He began to remember. It was not sorcery, it was not heresy. It was knowledge so old that men had called it evil only because they could not master it. The builders of the monastery, the true ones, had not come to pray. They had come to bury something, not a monster, a promise. Ewan did not believe himself chosen. He had no delusions of sainthood, but he understood, as the cold settled deeper into the stone and the monks' prayers grew quieter, that this place had waited for someone like him, voiceless, forgotten, but remembering. In the days that followed, one by one, the other novices began to dream in languages they did not know. Some woke weeping, some did not wake at all. A door appeared where no door had been, carved into the walls behind the apothecary. The abbot's body, once buried, returned to the cloister floor, his eyes open, his mouth filled with petals of a flower no one had seen before. The monastery had become a mouth, and it was beginning to speak. But in the silence that followed, as frost laced the cloister arches and fire refused to warm, Ewan did one thing the others could not. He listened, and when he traced the name Elok in chalk upon the altar stone, it did not fade. It burned. Not all fire is destruction. Some is remembering. Some is return. Above, the crows had stopped circling. They now perched along the roofs, edge all facing inward, toward the cloister heart, waiting. So was he. For beneath every stone laid in fear, there waits something older than faith. And Ewan, voiceless, but remembering, had opened it. The wind would rise again soon, but next time it would not be carrying rain. The wind howled through the ruins of memory, stirring ash in the corners of the cloister walk, lifting fragments of old prayers that never quite found heaven. And beneath the graying sky of a late November dusk, the monastery exhaled. It began with a drip, a slow, persistent rhythm of melting snow against stone, striking the warm patch beneath the nave like the ticking of a clock that no longer told time. The monks no longer marked hours here. The bell tower had fallen silent since Thomas vanished. No one said his name. Names held power. Names could summon. But if one listened closely, past the rustling of robes and the hush of shuffled feet, one might still hear the faintest scratch beneath the fifth column, as if ink was still writing. Even after blood had dried, Thomas had come with questions. He left behind echoes. Now, the warmth beneath the nave grew. It pulsed like breath. And for the first time since that winter of 1271, the candle beside the altar refused to hold its flame. It flickered, hissed, and guttered out, not from wind, but from memory. The abbot, older now, with eyes like blackened glass, still walked barefoot through the halls. But he no longer wept. His feet bled in silence. He carried no bowl, no knife, only silence. And behind him, the youngest novitiate began to follow, a boy named Isidore, born to plague survivors, baptized in the soot of a burned-out chapel, and left at the monastery gate wrapped in a page from the Gospel of Luke. Isidore did not ask questions, but his dreams did. They came nightly now. Visions of Tomas kneeling at the edge of a great pit. Jars shattered around him, voices screaming not from mouths but from ink, his lips sewn shut with threads of hair, his eyes filled with firelight. Always he reached forward, palm open, as if offering something, as if warning, and each time Isidore awoke. The stone beside his cot was warm. One night, just before the feast of St. Julian, Isidore could bear it no longer. He slipped from the dormitory, past the snoring forms of the elder monks, and into the cloister walk. Moonlight scattered through the arches, cold and thin. He pressed his hand against the fifth column. Stone, just stone, but beneath it a beneather. Tremble, like breath held too long. He began to dig. His fingers scraped until they bled. Nails split. Skin tore, but the stone loosened, bit by bit, until it gave way with a soft moan, like a dying man's last confession. Behind it, wrapped in linen blackened by time, was the parchment. Tomas's words, written in rusted ink and smudged with blood. It was not a journal, it was a record, a memory made flesh. Isidore read dot, and as he read, the air shifted. The warm spot beneath the nave grew hot. The walls began to hum ever so faintly, a low throbbing sound like a chant sung backward. Somewhere above, in the scriptorium, books trembled on their shelves. The ink in the inkwells began to swirl. By morning, the abbot was dead. Face down on the nave's warm stones, his final expression twisted not in fear, but in relief, and Isidore was gone. Only his robe remained, folded neatly at the foot of the fifth column. In its pocket, the parchment, now blank. Yet the change could not be undone. In the days that followed, silence gripped the monastery tighter than winter ever could. The brothers ceased their chants. The bells did not toll. Shadows lingered longer than they should. And sometimes, from beneath the nave, came the sound of breathing, not one voice, but many, layered and tangled like roots beneath a forest floor. No one dared to touch the warm spot, except one, a mason, summoned to repair a crumbling section of wall near the old vestry, took note of the strange quiet. His hands, calloused by stone and lime, sensed the tremor beneath the floor. Curious, he lingered too long near the nave, tracing the uneven flagstones, feeling the pulse beneath them like a second heartbeat. That night, he dreamed of clay jars and blood-sealed mouths. He left before dawn, leaving his tools behind. He never returned home, and now something stirs beneath the monastery still. The monks speak less each day. Meals are taken in absolute silence. Candles burn faster than they used to. And the snow, when it falls, refuses to cover the cloister walk, as if the earth itself remembers what was unearthed. The parchment waits no longer. Its words have been read. Its blood has been touched, and the voices, once trapped, begin to learn the shape of freedom. They do not scream, they whisper through the cracks in stone, through the ink that dries too fast, through the dreams of anyone foolish enough to walk barefoot across sacred ground. The monastery was built to contain, but nothing stays buried forever. Somewhere beneath the nave, the jars begin to sweat, and above them a new novice kneels in prayer, her eyes closed, her lips stitched with thread, her palms open and waiting dot. The silence no longer protects, it remembers, and remembrance, like fire, cannot be unlit. It began with the scent of lavender and rot, not the perfume of fields or saints' oils, but something darker, flowers left too long on a grave, sweetness mingled with the breath of decay. It came from the stairwell behind the hearth, curling upward like a serpent exhaled from hell's throat. No fire had burned there in years, yet ashes clung to the air as if mourning had never ceased. The parchment rule found still whispered in his pocket, even though it held no voice. The stain at its edge, dark, iron-slick, old blood matched nothing he had seen before. Not war, not injury. This was something slower, more deliberate, like a name carved too deeply into one's own skin. Rule had always been quiet, always watched more than he spoke. The world had given him nothing save frost and stone, so he learned early how to listen for what others could not. And now, the monastery had begun to murmur through the bells, the rats, the steaming well, and the dreaming walls. Father Elian no longer left his cell. He sat like a forgotten statue, hands trembling, eyes white with the fog of lost time. When Rule asked about the word he'd muttered, unbound, the old man only pressed 2 fingers together, then parted them. A gesture of release, or surrender. The stair beckoned. Lantern in hand, Rule returned. The wax door waited at the bottom like a sealed mouth, pale, pulsing, glistening in the dim glow. It was not cold to the touch. It was warm, too warm, as if blood still flowed behind it, and the silver nail at its heart gleamed with the precision of cruelty. The robe that hung beside it was monk's cloth, but finer than any Rule had seen, black wool with red threading twisted in a pattern. That seemed to shift if you stared too long. He did not wear it. He dared not. Instead, he knelt not in prayer, but in remembrance, though he did not know what he was remembering. That was when the memory entered him. Not a voice, but the echo of one, carried through marrow like wind through reeds. You are one of many, one of few. The 5th to kneel, the 1st to choose. The lantern flickered. The wax door shimmered. Behind it, something stirred, not alive, but not dead. A weight of presence, like the hush before a scream. Rule stood. He placed his hand on the silver nail. It was cold, finally, something cold, and it bit his palm like a serpent's. Fang, he bled onto the wax. It hissed from above, far above, a bell cracked mid-swing. The sound echoed through stone and bone. Father Elian gasped in his cell. A mirror shattered in the scriptorium, untouched by hands. The wax began to melt, first in strands, then in rivulets, then in chunks that sloughed like shed skin. The door wept itself away. Behind it, no room, just space, vast and circular, like the inside of a skull. The air pulsed with the rhythm of breath, though no lungs remained. Clay jars lined the inner ring. Hundreds, maybe thousands, each sealed with wax, marked in languages lost to empire and dust. Each jar sang not aloud, but within the chest, as if the heart had ears. Rule stepped inside. He did not shake. He did not cry. He simply knew these were not relics, not records. They were souls, bound not in parchment or doctrine, but in memory, in guilt, in silence. A pedestal stood at the center. Upon it, a single jar, larger than the rest. The wax at its seal was cracked, not broken, but close. Hair curled from the fissure. A tooth had fallen loose, lying beside it like a warning, and carved into the base, Elian. The name chilled him above. Father Elian screamed. Rule ran. He fled the wax chamber, up the winding stair, through the fractured hearth, across the cold cloister stones. The parchment in his pocket burned like fire, as if trying to escape. When he reached Elian's cell, he found the old man on his knees, blood at his lips, eyes wide with sight he no longer possessed. I remembered, the monk rasped. I was the fourth. I sealed them. All of them. I was. And then, silence. Not death, just silence. The kind that lingers when something eternal has changed its shape. Rule stayed beside him until morning. The sky wept grey. The candles refused to burn. He buried Elian beneath the warm spot, the dip in the nave floor no one dared prey upon. He marked the grave, not with stone, but with ash and a feather. That night, the wax jar cracked further, not shattered. Not yet, but the monastery began to hum again. Not in fear, in anticipation. Rule, the orphan, the listener, the unspoken fifth, was now the only one left, and the memory inside him began to speak in dreams. The door had been melted, not destroyed. The souls waited still, and above, in the grain tower where no grain remained, something began to scratch. Not claws, hands. Hands that had forgotten how to pray, but remembered how to reach. The monastery was no longer asleep, and neither was what lay beneath. Tomorrow the bells would ring again, but not for mass, not for mourning, for release. Rain peeled the night open like a wound. The monastery bled silence between every thunderclap. Lightning scattered across the sky in crooked veins, as though some unseen hand was searching the heavens for a name long erased. And below that, haunted, storm, beneath the crumbling roof and sodden stone, the monastery listened, not with ears, but with memory, in the scriptorium, where words had once bound kingdoms and curses alike. Father Elian moved like parchment caught in wind. His breath came in verses, short and cracked, each syllable heavy with the dust of dead prayers. Laid before him were robes untouched by time, vestments of an order history had orphaned, stitched with thread that shimmered not with gold, but with ink that never dried. They smelled faintly of myrrh, and something deeper, like the last breath of a man who died remembering something he shouldn't. Elian did not look at Rule. His gaze drifted toward corners that held no light, where shadows gathered not because the torches failed, but because they were invited. When he spoke, it was not to the boy who had unearthed the waxen door, but to the silence that now wore the monastery-like skin. Rule stood still. He had not slept in 3 days, since the door, since the whisper. His mind was no longer his own. It was a corridor, echoing with images that did not belong to this world. He saw monks dragging chains across the refectory tiles, each link carved with a name and a date of death. He saw children walking backwards in procession, their mouths sewn shut with ash-dipped thread. He saw the high altar inverted, bones laid out in the shape of a man who had no eyes. No one else saw, but the walls knew. Elian's voice trembled, like candlelight. There was no famine, there was no plague. That was what the scrolls said. That was the lie. Rule did not respond. He could not. Every time he tried to speak, he tasted wax. It clung to his tongue, bitter and cold, as though memory itself were melting down his throat. The old monk continued, hands hovering over the robes, like a man about to anoint the dead. He spoke of the one beneath, a name forbidden not by decree but by fear, a thing spoken into belief during the black winter of 1124, when the sun vanished behind smoke and the grain turned to salt, when monks starved not from scarcity, but from a vow no man should ever take. It began as a fast, Elian whispered, a holy denial of flesh, meant to bring them closer to purity. But hunger is a prayer with teeth. And when the bodies began to fail, when tongues turned grey and fell from mouths like dying moths, something else was born, something beneath the monastery, or perhaps inside it. They gave it more than prayers. They fed it their pain, their madness, their dreams. Stories soaked in blood, names cut from tongues, infant cries silenced beneath hymns. Then they sealed it behind the door, not with iron or flame, but with wax, teeth, and silence, because silence is heavier than stone, and time, time does not forget. It ferments. Rule walked the halls that night like a ghost haunting its own life. He carried no lantern. Light no longer answered him. Instead, the shadows parted before his feet, as if they remembered his name. In the library, he found the oldest book of all, older than scripture, older than ink. It had no title, only grass dried and woven to hold its pages shut, as though even the earth wished it hidden. Its spine was stitched with hair, coarse and blackened, like it had been pulled from the scalp of someone who died screaming. He opened it. Each page began with the same word. Come, no sentence, no structure, just come. Over and over, come. The ink moved, not quickly, but not still either, like something dreaming just beneath the parchment surface. As he turned each page, he heard things, not with ears, but within the bone behind his eyes. Laughter, chanting, the creak of ropes, and a heartbeat that was not his own. That night, Rule did not light a candle. Light felt wrong, as though it would not illuminate, but offend. The monastery breathed with him. Floorboards pulsed, bells shivered without sound, and the well in the southern garden, the one that steamed though no heat touched the air, began to churn, like a mouth swallowing slowly. Below, far beneath cloister and chapel, the waxen door softened, not with heat, but with permission. A crack formed at its edge, just wide enough for something to exhale. In his cell, Elian lay prostrate before an empty altar. His rosary snapped mid-prayer, beads scattered across the stones like bones from a forgotten grave. His voice, once silent for decades, returned, not in Latin, but in a tongue no man should know. Not screamed, not whispered, but remembered, outside. The rain stopped, not slowed. Stopped. Every drop suspended in air like a string cut from time. Rule stepped into the crypt again. The stairs were not stairs now, they were vertebrae, winding, cracking with each step, as though he was descending the spine of something ancient and waiting. The walls no longer held bones, they wept, softly, as if mourning something not yet gone. The waxen door breathed, one long, slow inhale, like lungs, filling after centuries. Roul did not knock. He did not speak. He simply stood, and the whisper returned. Not a voice, not even a thought, but the memory of being chosen. The crack widened, a finger pale as milk, hairless, jointless, pressed against the seam, not pushing, just being. Above, in the scriptorium, Elian placed the old vestments over the back of a wooden chair, and stepped out into the night. The bells above the chapel began to toll, not rung, just moving, back and forth, their music hollow. He did not look up. Instead, he whispered a final word to no one. Witness. And somewhere, beneath miles of stone, the wax finally split. It did not burst. It unfolded like a wound, remembering how to bleed. Rule's breath caught. He did not run because, in that moment, he understood the truth of it. He was never meant to close the door. He was meant to enter, and behind that breathless threshold, something waited, not evil, not divine, just hungry, and the monastery, after centuries of silence, welcomed it home. The bells rang louder, and far to the west, where the land once cracked in fire during the famine of 1124, a field of poppies bloomed out of season, red as blood, soft as wax, and beneath them the earth began to hum. The first bell rang backward, a dull, aching note that echoed through stone-like breath, through a dying lung. The second followed slower, deeper, as if pulled up from the belly of the earth. No monk had touched the bell rope, no wind stirred the tower, yet every cloistered shadow turned to listen. Beneath the monastery, in the mouth of the forgotten chamber, Rule stood silent. The air clung to him like wet linen, not heavy, intimate, as though the room itself knew him. The stitched figure, still unmoving at the center, radiated no heat, no threat, and yet Rule felt himself unraveling, thought by thought, memory by memory, not forgetting, offering. A third bell tolled, and the wax behind him melted into the floor, sealing the passage. He did not look back. There was no longer a back, only forward into the hush. The walls were covered in parchment, not hung but grown, pulsing softly with veins like ink trails. Written on them were stories and languages that hurt to remember. Names he had never spoken filled his mouth like wine and ashdot, and then the voice, not from the veiled figure, but from the jars. A low hum at first, like bees beneath water, then words pressed through silence, like fingers through cloth. You came barefoot across the mines of your fathers. You drank from the wound. You called it truth. Rule's knees buckled. His hands reached the floor, but there was no dust, only a smooth black surface that rippled like skin. Beneath it, something watched, not cruelly, curiously. He heard his own voice speaking now, but not from his mouth. It spilled from the jar nearest the figure, and though his lips stayed closed, his story began. I was born to a woman who whispered through teeth. She told me no name, but fed me prayers. She marked me with soot. She said the world had turned backward before, and would again. As each word left him, the jar sealed tighter, until only a hum remained. Another jar began to glow. Another story took shape. It was not his. It belonged to a man long dead. A man who had carved the first rule into wood with a heated nail. The chamber was a reliquary, not of bones, but of remembrance. A mouth filled, not with hunger, but with history begging to be heard. Rule wept. Not from pain, but from the impossible intimacy of being known. The veiled figure lifted one hand, fingers of thread and tooth curled upward. In its grasp, a quill. It placed it at Rule's feet, and then pointed not to the walls, nor to the jars, but to Rule's own chest. Right, the silence said. Not as command, as covenant. He took the quill. Its stem was warm, its nib sharpened bone. He touched it to his skin and pressed until blood gathered like ink. On the floor, his first letter burned into the black, read against the void. I remember the moment he wrote it. The chamber responded, not with movement, with memory. Rule was no longer within his body. He stood in the famine of 1124. He saw monks eating bark, tearing pages from sacred books just to chew the starch. He watched them bury brothers who still breathed. He saw the one beneath, not summoned, but formed a shape woven from guilt, starvation, and a single desperate prayer spoken backward. Take the pain, hold it, swallow it down where God won't see. And something did. The vault was not built to imprison, it was a cradle. The monks had not sealed a monster. They had birthed a soul, collective, hungry, ancient, made not from evil, but excess memory. And now, centuries later, it had chosen Rule to continue the line. The monastery above continued to break. Oil turned to brine. Psalters bled ink. The bell ropes frayed on their own. And still, below, Rule wrote every name he had forgotten, every pain he'd dismissed. He wrote of love lost, of hunger unfed, of brothers drowned in silence. He wrote of Elian's blindness, a choice, not a curse, a vow to unsee what others refused to carry. He wrote of the veils his mother wore even when alone, of the way she spoke to shadows like kin. And the more he wrote, the more jars glowed, filling with stories, sealing shut. The chamber drank his memories like sacred wine. When he paused, the figure stepped closer. No footsteps, just presence. It extended a second quill, this one wrapped in silver thread. A second voice now joined the chamber. Higher, fractured a child's. Will you write for us too? He turned. There were other figures now, smaller, half-formed, stitched from wax and linen, memories unfulfilled, stories abandoned, children buried without names, martyrs whose tongues were cut before testimony. He understood. This was not possession. It was confession. A weight, not forced, but welcomed. He knelt again and whispered yes. Above, the rain stopped, but thunder lingered. In the cloister, Elian sat motionless in the chapel, facing the altar. His eyes, long blind, filled with blood, yet his mouth smiled. He has entered, the old monk said, though none remained to hear him. Back in the chamber, Rule's body began to fade, not die, dissolve. His skin turned to parchment, his bones to quills, his voice to ink. One final word he wrote, not on the floor, but in the air, : remember, and with that, the veiled figure stepped back. Another jar sealed shut, another light went out, but the mouth remained open, waiting not for flesh, for truth. And in the next room, a child's hand brushed a forgotten door. It was time for the next story to be told. They did not bury the bodies. By the time dawn should have broken, if dawn still answered this place, the remaining brothers were hollowed things, shadows wrapped in wool, soaked to the bone, eyes filmed over with reverence or ruin. They no longer wept, for the weeping had dried with the last baptism. No one spoke, not since the jars began to shatter. There was no ceremony, only the soft slump of robes as one brother dropped beside the well, blood pooling from his mouth, murmuring prayers in a tongue the abbey had never taught. Another flung himself into the cloister pond, the water still frozen, yet it parted for him as if it too remembered. There were no screams, only the sound of clay breaking below, steady as breath, crack, pause, like a heart trying to beat through. Centuries of silence. The wax in the candle holders had melted, though no flame had touched it. The bells, Those once hallowed instruments of divine rhythm lay shattered in the nave, their bronze lips split like broken promises. And above it all, the sky hung heavy, not stormed, not starless, but sick, grey without weight, silent without peace. The kind of sky you'd see before something remembered its name. Rule stood at the threshold of the scriptorium now, barefoot, ash layered into the cracks of his skin. He had not spoken since emerging from the vault, but the silence around him, bent as if waiting for command. The relic Elian had given him, the so-called splinter of the true cross, now glowed faintly within his sleeve, as though it recognized its place in a story far older than Calvary. His eyes no longer blinked, and when he moved, the walls seemed to breathe with him. The monks had once copied scripture here, binding words with gold leaf and goatskin. Now the pages turned themselves, not with wind but intent, as if the books had waited for centuries to correct their own lies. Latin turned to symbols, names rewritten. One codex, untouched for 100 years, flared open to a page that had never been inked, only charred, and across its surface crawled the image of a mouth with no face, no teeth, only song. Rule placed a hand on the book, and it closed like a child into sleep. Elian emerged at last from the chapel, barefoot, eyes lined in soot. His voice was thin. "Have you become it?" Rule did not answer, but the ground cracked beneath his feet. Roots curled from the stone like veins reaching toward memory. "The song is waking," Elian whispered, tears streaking down his cheek. I heard it, not in the ears, in the spine. Then came the echo, not from Rule, but beneath him. A second voice, buried inside the first. It spoke not words, but memories. A funeral without a name. A birth without a mother. A scream that had never been allowed. Rule opened his mouth, and the song began. It was not music. It was not chant. It was the weaving of all that had been swallowed. Every secret hidden in cellar prayers. Every betrayal scraped clean from confession. Every face forgotten by time. It spilled out as vibration, the kind that rattled teeth, that peeled paint from walls, that made the rats flee in droves without knowing why. The library door buckled, the altar split, statues turned. One by one, the relics of the saints blackened, their glass eyes weeping blood or oil or something that could not be touched in the courtyard. The soil cracked open, but no bones rose, only hair. Long strands, tangled in roots, reaching toward. The chapel steps like pilgrims denied entrance. The monks who remained dropped to their knees, not in devotion, but in surrender, because this was not God, and it was not devil, it was the mouth of memory, the buried cry of all who had been. Silenced beneath stone, beneath creed, beneath centuries of well-meaning men and holy intentions. It was not angry, it did not accuse, it only sang, and in that song was the sound of the first lie, and the first hand that struck a child, and the first oath broken in the name of power, and the first woman drowned for dreaming, and the first monk who swallowed truth so that gold could be offered instead. Elian fell forward, his face against the cold stone. "I see her," he sobbed. "I see the girl they walled in, the one from the Psalms. She had no grave." Rule reached toward him, but his hands stopped short. His skin had begun to crack, not with age, but with light. Lines of fire veined beneath the surface, as if he were becoming less flesh, more vessel. Behind them, the cloister arches shimmered. Shadows moved where no figures stood. You could hear them now, not in words, but in presence. Those who had been forgotten were no longer quiet. The monastery was a house of echo, and now every echo had come home. Somewhere, a door slammed, though no door was left. A great inhale drew through the stones, and then the song ceased, not with silence, but with listening, as if something, someone, was waiting for what came next. The brothers, those few who remained, huddled near the crumbling font, had begun to bleed. Not water, not wine, but ink. Thick, black, warm. And when one monk touched it, he gasped, for it wrote his name. Not the name he bore in life, but the one his mother never got to say before the fever took her. The monastery was no longer stone. It was parchment and rule pallid. Bone-thin, humming with memory, was the quill. Elian stood once more. Is it over? Rule turned, slowly. His voice came not from his throat, but from the walls. It has not even begun. A gust swept through the nave, though no wind stirred outside. Candles relit with black flame. The cross behind the altar inverted itself, not in blasphemy, but as if seeking to remember what had been beneath it all along, far beneath the earth, where the jars had once lined the vaults. A new silence settled, not absence, expectation. The mouth had sung, and now it listened outside the monastery walls. Thunder rolled over the highlands again, but this time it was not warning, it was applause. And somewhere across the valley, a child woke in the night and began to scream.